the real existential issue when it comes to open source software is sustainability. There are governance bodies like the OpenJS Foundation or the Linux Foundation that are helping with governance at a wider level when it comes to open source software. But those are really run by donations or contributions. When you look at the business model there of how money flows from big corporations, it's all very altruistic. Is there a way, though, that we can use decentralized autonomous organizations, crypto, to help fund open source software? We're still dealing with humans, though. So how do we organize as humans? I think that's going to be the core of it. And to me, when it comes to open source software and sustainability, it goes and points back to governance. And this governance model and being able to create incentive mechanisms, designs around sustainability of open source software.
The designers of this movement really explicitly rejected economic considerations. They wanted to keep money kind of outside of the information commons that they're creating. And also governance. They really didn't want to address questions of how this stuff would be governed. And as a result, we've ended up in a world where some of the most important open source projects are really controlled by large, powerful companies, from Linux being at the core of the Android operating system that Google uses, to GitHub being owned by Microsoft. Where because open source communities did not have their own economy, they kind of conceded that economy to these big, highly centralized companies. At the same time, because these communities didn't really create robust governance structures, you have these persistent dictatorships for life. We see with efforts like Gitcoin, and Open Collective means of enabling open source projects to be sustainable, to build economies of their own. And then with projects like the Ethical Source effort, the Organization for Ethical Source, we see efforts to enable technologists to have those deep ethical conversations of what do we want and don't we want this technology to be used for.
My co-founder, Eric, and I are both software engineers by background, and we've worked on 2 technical infrastructure startups prior to this, one that succeeded and had a good outcome, and one that failed and didn't have an outcome. And we actually had some hard learnings in the ones that failed about the pains of building on closed platforms and within proprietary ecosystems. The success of that business depended on these big tech platforms like Facebook, Google, Pinterest, and Twitter to open up their kind of developer APIs and experiences for publishing to developers in a way that they indicated they were going to do. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, they did not. And that dramatically affected our business's ability to succeed, to distribute our content and our economics in a way that just felt totally out of our control. And we said, never again will we build on closed platforms like this. Never again will we rely on, Apple for distribution of our app when they control whether it can or cannot go forward. And with the rise of these open web development platforms, really driven by things like Ethereum, we said, for the first time, there is a whole new platform that lets developers embed economic incentives into open source software and incentivize people to contribute to it, incentivize people to run this software, to form networks and to build out infrastructures in a way that let them participate in the economic upside of the usage of these networks. And that was a light bulb moment. That was a super powerful idea for us.
The nice things about a protocol-based approach and then building an application on top of it is that you can take a bunch of pieces that are really useful, and you don't have to rebuild them, and that they interrupt with other approaches. And so you have oftentimes a larger starting base than having to build it up from scratch yourself and get everyone into your own personal silo, right? The fact that you can have different implementations, on the same protocol, communicate with each other and operate with each other, opens up all sorts of possibilities that make it easier for new services to try out things without having to, completely convince people to leave whatever other service they were using, or just to even try out a new service. The switching costs are much lower. And so there's a lot of benefits there. But basically, the focus should be on trying to build a better mousetrap.
We can write this once and solve, like, for example, safe math. A common problem in Solidity is you do math and it overflows and that causes bugs. And so you write one really well-tested, pluggable library, and then everyone can use it and solve that problem for everyone. And that's just really awesome. And you can it's hard to even think about that happening in a closed source way. It's the open sourceness of it, the community aspect, and the commons that everyone's contributing to that really is what makes open source incredible. And it does feel like a sort of 10x improvement over how we used to organize.
The code is, it's forkable, it's buildable, it's open source, it's there for anyone to build on. And that way you get a much faster rate of innovation across the space. So it's very collaborative, which is, often an interesting tension when you work in startups and ventures and you're competing for, eyeballs and users and all that stuff. But at the base layer, it's a very collaborative space because, the fastest way to get from point A to point B is to build off someone else's code. The rate of innovation, between walled gardens isn't going to be as fast as this crazy network of, people and talented teams just building off each other. And I think the rate of innovation in crypto is just mind-boggling.
When you're this open, you're actually thinking with this abundance mentality. So you're thinking to yourself, if I put my artwork out into the world and I let everyone else look at it and learn from it and examine it and grow from virtue of my examples being out there in the world, then you're actually creating an abundance mentality for everyone. You're just basically providing to a sort of a common knowledge. Now, how do you continue to, sustain yourself economically out of this abundance mentality? I would say you have to continue to be open and creative and design, business models around the abundance mentality that basically that keep this sort of project and movement going.
The reason why, for instance, open source hasn't necessarily been seen as a viable path forward is because, again, you combine something like that with the scarcity mentality, and they just don't work together. One is competition, the other one is collaboration. And so we kind of have to, at this stage, because the technology is there for us to enable us to do a lot of very interesting permutations and very interesting flows that were not possible with the technology before. We really have to make sure that the technology moves in sync with our unlearning and with our almost re-education in that abundance mindset and in that collaborative mindset. And I think the more we push for that, the more we're going to all get comfortable with open source economies as well. Because at the end of the day, this is what we should be building towards, where we do have these modular components, and we are able to just very transparent documentation, very transparent instructions on how these modular pieces can be used, and then empower people to take them as they need to provide solutions for their very specific problems, for their very specific use cases.
The good news is that we have about 20 years worth of history from the open source movement that can show how incredibly powerful technologies can be built. However, there are also really important lessons from the last 20 years with open source, which is that just because something is open, both as an open invitation and open development, doesn't mean that something is actually inclusive. Inclusivity is an active effort, and it requires people to proactively seek out how to create proper inclusion, especially from individuals who might be on the margins of power or the margins of society, who may have historically faced challenges. Those individuals can't just be assumed to be taken care of in an open source community. And indeed, the statistics bear this out. Open source technology is overwhelmingly male, it's overwhelmingly young, and it's overwhelmingly Western and white. That's a problem. And so we need to really evaluate all the incredible architectural opportunities here, and then think specifically about how we're going to look at inclusion and community building. That's a really incredible opportunity for Web3 to get right day one.
Demographics show that the average age of developed countries is getting older and older. So that includes the US and most of Europe and Japan as well. And then you've got the demographics of 1 billion people being added to sub-Saharan Africa, whose age is somewhere going to be between average age of 15 to 19, a very young population. And same goes for the Middle East and Southeast Asia as well. So when I think about demographics and what we need to do, we need to actually have blockchain projects that focus on education today that help those young people to be the drivers of our solutions of today and tomorrow. And when I think about who we need to arm with education and knowledge today, it's those young people sitting in those regions of the world, and for the leaders in this space to enable that. And it is focusing on not only understanding blockchain technology and decentralized web and the tools around it, but also how we could harness all of these benefits that we've just talked about, and then have those young people find the solutions for tomorrow.